people who think you're responsible for your wife's disappearance.
Any response?
I said I've never harmed Lynette, and I never would harm Lynette, and I want to find Lynette.
Brian Hooker walked out of custody just after 72 hours. No charges, no arrest, and still no clear answer to what happened to his wife. Within hours, he was speaking to the media in the same calm, direct tone he uses, standing by the same version of events, that it was an accident, a fall, and a night that went wrong. But now new details have started to surface. Some of them didn't quite line up. Boating experts in the Bahamas have begun questioning the conditions that night, suggesting the water may not have been as rough as described. There were also questions about how far he drifted and whether that movement makes sense. Even the boat itself, how it works, what it can and can't do, started coming under closer scrutiny. And behind the scenes, the case didn't slow down. Another agency has also begun taking a closer look, because this is not something that could simply be closed and left behind. Now, the question isn't just what happened that night. It's whether that version of events can actually hold up when you start examining the details. We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything. This is the latest update in the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. In our earlier coverage, the focus was on the night she vanished and what was happening in her life leading up to it. But now, the case has shifted. Brian Hooker has been released from custody. The investigation is still active, and new voices are beginning to challenge key parts of his account. Because as more information comes in, some of the details don't seem to fit together as neatly as they first appeared. For 3 days, Brian Hooker was inside a police station in the Bahamas. 72 hours. That's how long investigators had to decide what to do with him. Charge him or let him go. By the final day, that decision had been made. He was released. No charges, no arrest, just a brief statement from the police. And then he walked out. Outside, cameras were already waiting. Reporters lined up near the entrance, calling out questions before he even stepped through the door. Because by then, the story had spread. A woman missing at sea, a husband who was the only witness, and a timeline that didn't quite fit together. So when the doors opened, it didn't feel routine. Brian stepped out into that moment, past the cameras, past the questions, past the attention that had been building while he was inside. Within minutes, the footage was everywhere. Him leaving the station, free to go. And for a moment, it almost felt like the case had stopped there. But it hadn't. Because being released doesn't answer anything. It doesn't explain what happened that night. It doesn't confirm one version over another. It only means that, at that point, there wasn't enough to charge him. And that's very different from being cleared. Because while Brian was no longer in custody, the situation itself hadn't changed. Lynette was still missing. No new evidence had been made public. No clear explanation had emerged. Which means those 72 hours, the questioning, the review, everything investigators looked at, led to a decision. But not an answer. And almost as soon as he stepped outside, Brian began speaking publicly, which raises a different kind of question. If he was released that quickly, what did investigators actually find during those 3 days? Not long after Brian walked out of custody, an official statement was released. It was brief, straight to the point, carefully worded. It confirmed what had just happened. He had been released after consultation with prosecutors. But the part that stood out wasn't at the beginning. It came a few lines in. A single phrase, no charges at this time.
I said I've never harmed Lynette, and I never would harm Lynette, and I want to find Lynette.
That wording matters because it doesn't close a case. It doesn't clear a suspect. It leaves something open. And just below that, there was another detail. The investigation was still ongoing. Not paused, not finished, still active. Authorities made it clear they were continuing to gather information. They even asked the public to come forward. Anyone who might have seen something or knew something that hadn't been shared yet. And that changes how the release is understood. Because if everything had already been resolved, there would be nothing left to ask for. But that's not what this was. This was a decision made within a time limit. 72 hours to either move forward with charges or release him. And when that window closed, they chose not to charge him. At least, not yet. And that yet carries weight, because it means the timeline isn't finished. The evidence isn't complete. Whatever investigators were looking for, they didn't have enough of it. At least not enough to take the next step. So now, the case sits in a different place. Brian is no longer in custody, but he's still part of the investigation. And everything that happened that night still depends on what can be confirmed next. Not long after his release, Brian Hooker began speaking publicly. The cameras that had been waiting outside the station weren't the end of it. They were the beginning. Within a short time, he appeared in interviews with major outlets, structured conversations, recorded segments, a chance to explain what happened on his terms. And in each of those appearances, the story remained the same. He described the night as an accident, a sudden fall, unstable conditions, a moment that unfolded too quickly to stop. The details followed the same sequence he had already given, the same explanation of the water, the same description of how he lost sight of her, the same account of what happened after. There were no major changes, no visible adjustments, just consistency. And alongside that consistency, there was something else, the tone. It was always measured, controlled, and carefully paced. He spoke about being separated from Lynette, about the difficulty of not knowing where she was. But even in those moments, his delivery remained steady. There were no sharp shifts, no visible breaks in composure. Everything stayed contained, and that became part of the story as well, because these interviews weren't happening in isolation. They were being watched by the public, by those following the case, and by people trying to understand what had happened that night. For many, these appearances became the primary way they encountered Brian's version of events. Not through reports, not through secondhand accounts, but directly. And when a single version of a story is repeated, clearly, consistently, without change, it can begin to settle into our minds. Not because it's confirmed yet, but because it has become familiar. At the same time, new information was starting to emerge elsewhere. Details that hadn't been part of those interviews. Questions that weren't addressed in those conversations. And that creates a point of tension, because on one side there's a version of events being presented clearly, without variation, and on the other, there are details still being uncovered. Details that may or may not align with what's being said. At first, everything stayed local. Authorities in the Bahamas responded to the report. They began searching the area. They spoke with Brian, the only person who had been there that night. And for a while, the case moved within that space. It felt contained. But then, everything started to expand. Another agency stepped in, the United States Coast Guard. At first, that wasn't unusual. Search and rescue teams often assist in cases like this, especially when someone is missing at sea. They help cover more water. They support the search already in progress. But as time went on, their role didn't stay limited to that, because by this point, more information had started to surface. Details from Lynette's family, things from the past, parts of the timeline that didn't sit as neatly as they first seemed. And that information didn't stay in one place. It moved between agencies, between jurisdictions. And once that happens, the case starts to feel different. It's no longer just about finding someone. It becomes about understanding what led to that moment in the first place. The Bahamian authorities continued their work, but now there was another layer alongside them, another group reviewing the same details, looking at the same timeline, asking their own questions. And that kind of attention doesn't happen in every case. Not every disappearance draws in multiple agencies. Not every situation grows beyond where it started, but this one did. And as it expanded, the focus began to shift. Less about searching the water and more about examining what happened on it. Because once more people are involved, with more information to work through, the question changes. It's no longer just, where is she? It becomes, what exactly happened that night? Up to this point, Brian's account hasn't really changed. He's described the same sequence each time: a fall, rough water, a situation that got out of control very quickly. But consistency on its own doesn't explain what actually happened. So the focus starts to shift. Instead of just hearing the story, investigators begin to take it apart, step by step. They start with the setting, a small dinghy, Open water near the harbor, a short trip, something that should have taken only a few minutes. According to Brian, the conditions that night weren't calm. He described waves moving through the area, wind pushing against the boat, enough movement to make things unstable. And in that moment, he says, Lynette fell overboard, and it happened suddenly and without warning. From there, everything changes, because once she's in the water, what happens next becomes critical. Brian says he lost control of the situation, that the engine was no longer usable, that he couldn't turn the boat back toward her. Instead, the dinghy began to drift, carried by wind and current, slowly moving away. He describes trying to respond, paddling, trying to move back toward where she had fallen, but over time, the distance grew, and eventually she was no longer visible. After that, his account becomes about getting through the night, alone in the boat. Moving without a clear direction, hours passing in the dark until he finally reached land. That's the sequence as he tells it, from the fall to separation to drifting through the night. But once it's laid out like this, each part starts to stand on its own. Not as a single story, but as a series of moments that can be looked at more closely. The conditions, the movement of the boat, the time between each step, all of it can be examined. And when you start looking at it that way, the question changes. It's no longer just about what was said. It becomes whether each part of that sequence can actually happen the way it's been described. And if his version of events is accurate, does the environment around it actually support it? Now that the timeline has been laid out, the focus starts to shift, not just on what was said, but on where it happened. Because Brian's version of events depends a lot on one thing: the water. He describes it as rough, unstable, moving enough to make a small boat hard to control. In that kind of situation, losing balance becomes easier. That's the setting he gives. But when people who know that area began to speak, a different picture came up. A local captain, someone familiar with those waters, shared his view. He described the Sea of Abaco as generally calm, especially near the harbor routes. It's a protected area, not fully open to strong waves like the ocean. So when conditions like 3-foot waves are mentioned, it sounds strange. Not impossible, but not typical for that location. Around the same time, others who were out on the water that evening said similar things. Nothing unusual, no strong waves. Just a normal night, and that creates a problem. Because now there are two different versions of the same setting. One where the water plays a big role, and one where it doesn't. And that difference matters. Because if the water was calm, then the fall isn't as easy to explain. It's no longer just about the conditions. It becomes something else, something that hasn't been fully explained yet. Because if the water wasn't working against them, what actually led to that fall? So, once we question these conditions, the focus shifts again. This time it's about movement. Not just what happened that night, but how far that version of events actually goes. Because according to Brian, after everything went wrong, the boat didn't stay where it was. It moved. Through the night, he says he drifted, and at times tried to paddle. Slowly, without full control, the boat kept going. Eventually, he says it carried him away from where Lynette had fallen and toward land. But when you look at that movement more closely, it covers quite a distance, not just a short drift, several miles. And that's where questions start to come in. Because moving that far in a small dinghy without an engine isn't simple. Water doesn't just carry you in a straight line. The current changes, the wind shifts. Sometimes you move forward, sometimes you barely move at all. So even over several hours, there's no guarantee of steady progress. It depends on too many things: direction, conditions, timing. And when you put all of that together, the path becomes harder to predict. A local expert familiar with small boats described that kind of movement as difficult. Not impossible, but not something that happens easily. It would take effort and time and the right conditions working together. Then there's the physical side of it. Paddling through the night, in the dark, without a clear sense of direction, has its limits. Fatigue sets in. Visibility drops. It becomes harder to stay on course. So when you compare the time he describes and the distance he ended up covering, they don't line up neatly. One suggests a slow drift, the other suggests more movement than you'd expect. And that gap is hard to ignore, because if the distance is correct, then how he got there becomes unclear. And if his movement is correct, then the distance itself becomes the question. The question now is, if covering that distance isn't easy, how did he end up at shore by morning? By now, a lot of the story has been examined. The conditions, the distance, how the boat moved. But there's one detail that everything seems to depend on: the boat itself. According to Brian, after Lynette fell into the water, the engine stopped working. He says the key was lost at that moment, and without it, he couldn't restart the engine, which meant he couldn't turn back. That part of the story makes us ask a very important question. Why couldn't he return to where she had been? This is because small boats like that are built to be simple. They don't rely on just one system to work. There's usually a safety feature called a kill switch. It shuts the engine off if the driver loses control, but it can also be reset. In many cases, the engine can be started again without needing a traditional key, sometimes even manually, which raises a different possibility that the engine may not have been completely unusable, that there could have been a way to get it running again, even if only for a short time. And that changes how this part of the story is viewed. Because if the boat could still move under power, then something else prevented it from turning back. Not just a mechanical issue, but something in that moment. A limitation, a decision, or something we don't fully understand yet. And that becomes important. Because everything that follows, the direction of the boat, how far it traveled, how long it took, all depends on this one detail. That if the engine could have been restarted, what stopped him from going back? Before looking at what the boat did or how far it moved, there's another part of this that matters. What people usually do in a situation like this. Because time on the water, especially at night, comes with its own habits. Not rules written down somewhere, just things people learn from experience. Simple things: carrying a light, having a way to call for help, being able to signal if something goes wrong. Not for long trips, but for moments that don't go as planned. And at night, those details matter more, because once it's dark, everything becomes harder to judge. Distance, direction, even where you are. So people tend to move more carefully. They keep trips short, they stay aware of their surroundings, they avoid taking unnecessary risks. That's especially true with small boats. They're more exposed, more sensitive to movement, less forgiving if something goes wrong. And in this case, the location itself adds another layer. This wasn't far offshore, land wasn't miles away, which means in most situations, direction can be adjusted without too much difficulty, especially if you can see clearly, if you're prepared, and if you react quickly. There's also been some mention of alcohol that evening, not confirmed, but part of the discussion. If it played a role, it could affect balance and decision-making. This is not an answer, just another piece to consider. And when you step back and look at all of this, the setting, the timing, the choices being made, it forms a picture of how things usually go. And when something doesn't follow that pattern, that's when questions start to come in. Because if these are the kinds of precautions people rely on, why didn't this situation follow that pattern? At this point, the case isn't built around just one story anymore. There are different pieces now. What happened that night, details that don't fully line up, and an investigation that's still ongoing, because even after everything that's been looked at, Lynette Hooker is still missing. She hasn't been found. There's no confirmed location, no clear moment that explains exactly what happened. And without that, the timeline is still incomplete. Legally, not much has changed. No charges have been filed. Brian Hooker is no longer in custody. But the case hasn't stopped. Investigators are still working, still going through information, still trying to understand what fits and what doesn't. At the center of it all, his account is still the only direct version of that night. But now, it's being looked at alongside other details. Questions about the conditions, the distance the boat traveled, how the engine works, and the decisions made along the way. None of these give a final answer, but they do make the situation more complex. Because instead of one clear explanation, there are now several points that don't fully connect, and each of those points is still open. So this is where the case stands now. No conclusion, no closure, just an investigation that's still active and a story that hasn't fully come together yet. He's no longer in custody. But as more of the details are examined, does his account still hold together? Or is something still missing? What do you think? We monitor true crime stories that you shouldn't miss, bringing you the main parts other people may have missed. You should subscribe now so you never miss anything.